March 3rd, 2022. In a quiet Utah neighborhood outside Park City, the Richins family home sat peacefully beneath the night sky. Inside, 3 young boys slept down the hallway, unaware that the night would soon become the defining moment of their lives. Behind a closed bedroom door, Eric Richins leaned back against the headboard of his bed, holding a copper mug filled with a cocktail his wife had prepared for him. A Moscow Mule. Vodka, ginger, beer, lime. A simple drink shared by couples everywhere. That evening had begun like many others. The house was calm. The children were safe. The future, at least on the surface, looked promising. According to Kouri Richins, the drink had been prepared as part of a celebration. She told investigators the couple was marking a business milestone related to a property purchase connected to her real estate ventures. Around 9 p.m., she brought the Moscow Mule to Eric while he sat in bed. The scene, as it would later be described, felt ordinary. A husband relaxing after a long day. A wife bringing him a drink. A quiet house settling into sleep. After finishing the cocktail, Eric remained in the bedroom while Kouri stepped away to check on one of their sons, who had woken from a night terror. She later told authorities that she stayed in the child's room afterward and eventually fell asleep there. For several hours, the house remained silent. No alarms, no cries for help, no indication that anything was wrong. But somewhere between that quiet evening drink and the early hours of the morning, Eric Richins would take his final breath. No one in the home would witness it. No one would hear it. And when the moment arrived that revealed the truth of that night, it would raise questions that still echo through courtrooms and headlines today. Just after 3 a.m., Kouri returned to the bedroom. What she claims she found would trigger a frantic call for help. She later told investigators that when she touched Eric, his body was cold to the touch. Moments later, a 911 dispatcher would hear her voice on the line. Her husband wasn't breathing. Emergency crews were on their way. Within minutes, flashing lights would cut through the quiet neighborhood as responders rushed to the house. Inside the bedroom, Eric lay unresponsive near the foot of the bed. Attempts to revive him would fail. Before dawn broke over Utah that morning, Eric Richins would be pronounced dead. At first, the situation appeared to be a tragic medical emergency. A husband gone unexpectedly. A young family devastated. A wife left behind with 3 children. But the truth about what happened inside that bedroom would soon transform a private family tragedy into one of the most talked about criminal cases in America. Because the deeper investigators looked into the hours leading up to Eric's death, the more questions began to appear. And those questions would eventually lead prosecutors to make a stunning allegation that the drink prepared that evening was not just a drink. Inside the Richins home, life appeared stable from the outside. The property sat in a peaceful Utah community, surrounded by wide roads, quiet yards, and families who valued routine. Neighbors often described the area as the kind of place where evenings were calm and children rode bicycles until sunset. Eric Richins had built his life through steady work. Known as a successful stonemason and business owner, he had developed a reputation for discipline and reliability. Friends described him as someone who valued family above everything else. His days were long, often spent managing projects and overseeing work crews, but his evenings were reserved for the people waiting for him at home. Those evenings usually followed a familiar rhythm. Dinner with the children, checking homework, talking through plans for the next day, and eventually settling into the quiet that comes after a full household finally slows down. Kouri Richins had built her own ambitions in real estate. She had spent years pursuing property investments and development opportunities. Some ventures succeeded, while others created financial pressure. Even so, the outward appearance of the household remained that of a young family, building a future together. At the center of that home were 3 young boys. At the time of Eric's death, they were 9, 7, and 5 years old. Their lives revolved around school, sports, and the small everyday moments that define childhood. To them, their father was a steady presence. He coached them through small frustrations, encouraged their interests, and created the kind of environment many families hope to maintain, one where children feel secure and supported. Inside the house that night, the boys were asleep down the hallway. The doors to their rooms were closed. The hallway lights were dim. Nothing in those quiet bedrooms suggested that within hours, their lives would change permanently. Back in the master bedroom, Eric's evening routine was coming to an end. He had finished dinner. The house had grown quiet. The responsibilities of the day were finally fading into the background. On that particular evening, there was one more reason to relax. According to Kouri, the couple had reason to celebrate. She said she had just closed on the purchase of a house connected to one of her business ventures. To mark the occasion, she prepared a drink for Eric. It was a simple gesture, a moment couples share countless times in homes across the country. A drink at the end of the day, a quiet celebration. But in hindsight, that moment would become one of the most scrutinized details of the entire case, because what happened in the hours that followed would raise questions investigators would spend months trying to answer. The evening continued with a calm that felt completely ordinary. Eric sat in bed as the night settled around the house. The children were already asleep, and the quiet atmosphere created the kind of calm many parents look forward to after a long day. It was around 9 p.m. when Kouri walked into the bedroom carrying a copper mug. Inside the mug was a Moscow Mule, vodka, ginger beer, and lime. She later told investigators that the drink was meant to celebrate the purchase of a home for one of her real estate projects. Eric accepted the drink and began sipping it while sitting in bed. According to the timeline later presented in court documents, there were no visitors in the house that night. Only 4 people were present in the home: Eric, Kouri, and their 3 children. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Eric drank from the mug. The house remained silent. There were no signs of distress or alarm. At some point after the drink was delivered, Kouri left the bedroom. One of their sons had woken up frightened after a night terror. Kouri went to comfort him and eventually remained in the child's room. She later told investigators that she fell asleep there. Back in the master bedroom, Eric remained alone. No one saw him alive again. Phone records and later evidence would place investigators deep into the timeline of that evening, examining movements, messages, and small actions that might help explain what happened in the hours between that drink and the early morning emergency call. But at that moment, the house appeared still. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. No noise, no struggle, no warning. Only a quiet bedroom where a husband had gone to sleep after finishing a drink his wife had prepared. And somewhere in the hours that followed, Kouri Richins died. The Moscow Mule would become one of the most discussed details in the case. It was the final drink Kouri was known to consume that night. According to Kouri's statement to investigators, she had mixed the cocktail in the kitchen and brought it into the bedroom shortly after 9 p.m. The ingredients themselves were nothing unusual. Vodka, ginger, beer, lime, a combination served in homes and restaurants everywhere. But after Kouri's death, investigators began asking questions about that drink. The reason was simple. The autopsy results would later reveal that Kouri had 5 times the lethal amount of fentanyl in his system, a powerful synthetic opioid responsible for thousands of overdose deaths across the United States. Kouri had no history of drug abuse. Family members stated he did not use opioids recreationally. Medical records also did not indicate prescriptions for drugs that could explain such a toxic level. Those facts forced investigators to confront a disturbing possibility. If Kouri had ingested fentanyl that night, where did it come from? One of the earliest theories focused on the drink. The Moscow Mule was the last known item Kouri consumed before he went to sleep. If a substance had been mixed into the cocktail, it could potentially explain how the drug entered his system. But at that stage of the investigation, no one yet knew exactly what had happened. At that moment in time, the drink was simply a detail, a small piece of a puzzle that investigators had not yet begun assembling. For the Richins family, the night continued quietly until the early hours of the morning. The next known moment in the timeline came several hours later. Around 3 a.m., Kouri Richins returned to the master bedroom. She told investigators she woke up and went back to check on Kouri. What she says she found in that moment would become the turning point of the entire case. Kouri was lying in bed, unmoving, unresponsive. When she touched him, she later told police, his body felt cold to the touch. The realization was immediate. Something was terribly wrong. Moments earlier, the house had been silent. Now panic began to set in. Kouri grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The call would soon bring emergency responders rushing toward the quiet Utah home. Inside the bedroom, Kouri remained motionless. No response, no breathing, no movement. Within minutes, emergency vehicles were on the way. Shortly after 3:30 a.m., emergency crews arrived at the Richins home. Paramedics and sheriff's deputies entered the bedroom, where Kouri was lying on the floor, near the foot of the bed. Medical responders immediately began attempts to revive him. CPR, emergency medical procedures. Every effort focused on restarting his heart. But nothing worked. Eric showed no signs of recovery. After continued attempts to resuscitate him, emergency personnel pronounced Kouri Richins dead at the scene in the early morning hours of March 4, 2022. For the moment, the situation appeared to be a tragic and unexpected death. A healthy father of 3 had died suddenly in his own home. There were no visible signs of violence, no indication of a break-in, only a devastated household and a wife who had just discovered her husband unresponsive. But even in those earliest moments, small questions lingered. Questions that would grow larger once the medical examiner began reviewing the case. At first, authorities treated Eric's death as a possible medical emergency. Sudden deaths can occur in many ways. Heart conditions, undiagnosed illness, unexpected complications. But once toxicology testing began, the case took a dramatic turn. The results showed something investigators could not ignore. Eric had an extremely high level of fentanyl in his system, about 5 times the amount considered lethal. That discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Fentanyl is not a drug that appears in someone's system by accident, and Eric had no known history of using it. Now investigators faced a difficult question. How had it entered his body? The quiet house, where the night began peacefully, was suddenly the center of a growing investigation. A husband had died. A powerful drug was found in his system. And the only people in the home that night were his wife and their children. The truth behind those final hours would soon pull detectives into a complex timeline filled with financial pressure, personal conflict, and a series of events that prosecutors would later argue were anything but accidental. But before we continue deeper into this case, I want to ask you something. When you hear the details of this night, a drink prepared by a spouse, a quiet house, and a sudden death hours later, what do you think happened? Do you believe this was a tragic accident? Or do you think there was something far more deliberate taking place inside that home? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you're interested in real cases like this, cases where the truth slowly emerges piece by piece, welcome back to Bedtime Black Files, where life's most powerful lessons are revealed through unforgettable true crime events from around the world. If you're stepping into our community for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into it, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, because your support helps our family grow, connect, and keep these powerful stories alive also. Share it with someone who enjoys true crime stories that reveal how investigations really unfold. Because what investigators would eventually uncover about this case would shock an entire nation. Long before headlines, courtroom testimony, and criminal accusations, Kouri Richins was simply a young woman growing up in Utah. She was born April 20th, 1990, into the Darden family. Her mother, Lisa Darden, raised Kouri alongside her brother, Ronnie. Friends and relatives would later describe her as energetic, ambitious, and eager to build a life larger than the one she grew up with. Like many young adults, Kouri entered adulthood with big plans, but no clear path yet defined. Utah's culture often encourages early family life and strong community connections. Marriage, children, and stable careers are deeply rooted expectations in many towns across the state. Kouri seemed eager to embrace that path. She worked ordinary jobs during her early adulthood, including positions in customer service and retail. Those jobs provided income, but they were never the long-term future she envisioned for herself. Kouri wanted more. Friends later described her as someone fascinated with business opportunities. She liked the idea of financial independence and often talked about building something successful. Real estate eventually caught her attention. Utah's housing market had been expanding rapidly during the early 2010s. Investors across the state were purchasing older homes, renovating them, and reselling them for profit. For someone ambitious, the field seemed full of opportunity. Kouri began studying the industry and talking with people who were already working within it. The idea of flipping houses and managing property investments appealed to her. It promised independence, control, and the possibility of significant profits. But before that career path fully developed, another major change entered her life. A relationship. And the man she would soon meet was someone whose life appeared far more stable than her own. His name was Kouri Richins. Kouri Richins grew up in a very different environment. He was born on May 13, 1982, into a ranching family in Utah. His childhood involved long days outdoors helping with chores that came with rural life, mending fences, working with animals, and assisting with the daily responsibilities of maintaining a ranch. Those early experiences shaped his personality. Hard work was expected. Responsibility came early. Kouri carried those values into adulthood. Athletics became another important part of his youth. He participated in sports such as basketball, baseball, and soccer during his school years. Friends later remembered him as someone who enjoyed competition, but never lost sight of teamwork. After finishing high school, Kouri continued his education at the University of Utah, graduating in 2011. But his entrepreneurial path had actually begun even earlier. 2 years before finishing college, Kouri co-founded a business called C&E Stone Masonry with a close friend and business partner. The company specialized in high-end stonework, custom patios, door kitchens, decorative masonry designs for luxury homes around Park City. The region's growing real estate market created strong demand for skilled craftsmanship, and Kouri's company steadily built a reputation for quality work. By the time he reached his early 30s, Kouri had established something many people spend decades trying to build: a successful business, a stable income, a strong reputation among clients. Yet, despite professional success, his personal life had not been without hardship. Kouri had previously experienced a difficult divorce earlier in his life. That experience left him cautious about future relationships. Still, he hoped one day to build the family life he had always wanted. And eventually, he would meet someone who seemed to share that vision. Kouri and Kouri met around 2009. The details of their first introduction were simple. They crossed paths through mutual connections in their local community, and the relationship developed quickly. Friends later recalled how closely the two seemed to bond. Their early relationship carried the excitement many couples experience during the first stages of love. They spent time together frequently. Conversations about the future came easily. Within a few years, their relationship had grown serious enough that marriage became the next step. But there was already an important factor Eric wanted addressed before the wedding: a prenuptial agreement. Because Eric owned a successful business and had already experienced one divorce, protecting his assets mattered to him. The agreement they signed stated that each spouse would retain ownership of their personal income and property. There was one important exception. If Eric died while they were still married, ownership of his masonry business would transfer to Kouri. At the time, the document likely seemed like a routine legal safeguard. Few people imagined that such a clause might one day become central to a criminal investigation. But years later, prosecutors would point directly to that detail, while explaining what they believed had motivated the crime. At the time, however, none of that existed. In 2013, Eric and Kouri were simply preparing for their wedding. On June 15, 2013, Eric Richins and Kouri Darden stood together in the backyard of their Utah home and exchanged vows. The setting was intimate. Family members gathered nearby. Friends celebrated alongside them. It was the kind of ceremony that marks the beginning of a shared life. The couple had already begun building that life together. By the time they married, they had welcomed their first child. Marriage simply formalized what had already begun. The ceremony represented stability, commitment, and the promise of a future. The couple settled into their home life quickly. Eric continued managing his masonry company. Kouri began exploring opportunities in real estate. From the outside, everything appeared to be moving forward exactly as planned. But like many marriages, the reality inside the household was far more complex than the image presented to others. Family life soon became the center of everything. Eric and Kouri welcomed 3 boys over the following years. The children, Carter, Ashton, and Weston, became the heart of the household. For Eric, fatherhood was deeply important. Friends and relatives later described how much he enjoyed spending time with his sons. He took them outdoors whenever possible. Camping trips, sports activities, weekend adventures around Utah's mountains and trails. Those moments reflected the same upbringing Eric had experienced during his own childhood. Work was important, but family came first. For Kouri, motherhood also became a defining part of her identity. Raising 3 young boys required constant attention and energy. School routines, doctor appointments, homework, the daily rhythm of family life. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Richins household appeared vibrant and successful. A thriving family with strong foundations. But as the years passed, another ambition began to dominate Kouri's focus: real estate. And that ambition would eventually place the couple under enormous financial pressure. Before the events of 2022 that so dominated headlines, Kouri's ambitions lay in the real estate market. In 2019, she founded a company called Kouri Richins Realty LLC, often referred to simply as her real estate or house flipping business. The goal was straightforward: purchase older homes, renovate them, and resell them for profit. In theory, the model works well when the market is hot, and repairs are managed within budget. According to a forensic accountant's testimony in court, early in the business's life, the strategy seemed plausible, but almost immediately, financial challenges began to show. Instead of making tidy profits, the company's finances were overextended. Kouri relied heavily on hard money loans, short-term lending designed for investors to get quick capital for fix-and-flip projects. These loans carried high interest rates and required aggressive repayment terms. Court testimony detailed that the company's financial structure became increasingly unstable as it took on more and more projects without corresponding revenue to cover costs. Kouri began drawing on loans almost as soon as they were approved, and expenses piled up faster than sales. By late 2021, evidence presented in court showed that Kouri Richins Realty had amassed millions in liabilities. One expert testified that by March 2022, the month Eric died, Kouri owed roughly $7.5 million across various lenders, including high-interest calculations requiring tens of thousands in monthly payments. Even before the fatal night of March 3 to 4, the business had become a significant source of stress inside the household. Banks, lenders, and private investors were pressing for repayment. Overdraft fees, bounced checks, and daily loan interest became a relentless financial pressure. Throughout this period, there were never public declarations of success or profits that matched the mounting obligations. Instead, the available records suggested a business that was financially unstable, frequently operating with negative balances and facing lawsuits from creditors trying to recover money owed. And as the debt grew, the stakes rose. What had begun as a business venture that promised independence and achievement was now a burden that influenced nearly every decision Kouri made. At the center of the financial strain was a property purchase that became symbolic of the couple's problems. In December 2021, Kouri agreed to purchase a large, unfinished mansion in Midway, Utah, a high-end property with a multi-million-dollar price tag. The deal was unusual, not only for its size, but because it came when her business was already overwhelmed with expenses. Prosecutors presented court documents stating that Kouri Richins Realty owed at least $1.8 million in hard money loans on the very day Eric died. By the following day, as more debts matured, they owed nearly $5 million. Even though the property was under contract, Kouri lacked the capital to complete renovations. A forensic accountant noted that in notes associated with securing the property, Kouri admitted she didn't have the $3 million needed for repairs, but believed the project could be profitable anyway. This purchase became a centerpiece of the prosecution's motive argument. It represented a gamble that required a massive inflow of capital to succeed, something her existing loans and cash flow could not provide. Because the closing was scheduled on March 4th, 2022, the morning after the night Eric died, the timing added to investigators' scrutiny. To many observers, the mansion project wasn't just a business decision. It was an ambitious attempt to salvage a failing financial portfolio. But it would also become one of the critical threads prosecutors highlighted when connecting Kouri's financial stress to the events that followed. In addition to mounting business debt, evidence shows that Kouri took out multiple life insurance policies on Eric's life without his knowledge. Court filings indicate that between 2015 and 2017, she purchased at least 4 insurance policies on him, collectively worth nearly $2 million in benefits. These policies were separate from a $500,000 policy that Eric later put under a family trust. During the estate planning process in 2020, Eric changed several details of his financial arrangements, including life insurance beneficiaries, a decision Kouri was unaware of at the time. Investigators later found that when Eric consulted lawyers in October 2020, he created the Kouri Richins Living Trust. This trust placed his assets, including his business interest in life insurance proceeds, under the control of his sister Kouri Richins Benson, with the intent to benefit his children rather than his wife. Kouri's ownership of at least 4 pre-trust life insurance policies meant that after Eric's death, she personally received significant payouts from those policies, totaling roughly $1.3 million in death benefits, according to financial testimony in court. While life insurance is commonplace among married couples, the fact that many of these policies were obtained without Eric's full knowledge became an emotional focal point in trial testimony and civil litigation around the estate. These details later became central to the prosecution's argument that financial gain was a motive for what happened in March 2022. As financial pressures increased, so did tension between Eric and Kouri. Evidence presented in separate civil filings and testimony revealed that in 2020, Eric discovered that large amounts of money had been taken from his accounts without his consent. Court documents allege that Kouri had withdrawn roughly $200,000 from his personal accounts, charged another $30,000 on his credit cards, and used a fraudulent power of attorney to borrow at least $250,000 in his name. When Eric confronted her about the irregularities, she promised to repay him, but the repayments either did not happen or were insufficient. These revelations were deeply unsettling. For Eric, not only were his personal accounts affected, but those withdrawals contributed to the larger debt picture that had encircled the family's financial life. This discovery marked a critical shift in the marriage as Eric began to reevaluate his trust in Kouri's management of their finances. By October 2020, after learning about these financial irregularities, Eric took steps to protect his family's future. He consulted with divorce and estate planning attorneys. Eric established the Kouri Richins Living Trust, transferring his business interest and reassigning control of his estate to his sister. He also changed beneficiaries on certain policies so that Kouri no longer stood to inherit key assets directly. Court records show that Eric did not disclose these changes to Kouri before his death. He wanted to prevent further erosion of the assets he intended for his children. As his financial alarm grew, Eric also considered divorce. His frustration and concerns culminated in discussions with his brother-in-law and divorce attorneys, and in at least one instance, plans were underway to pursue legal separation because of the financial strain and trust breakdown. The presence of a premarital agreement that protected Eric's business complicated matters, but the trust and estate changes showed that he was determined to secure an outcome that would preserve his children's future. From this point forward, the narrative moved from domestic conflict into complex legal and financial maneuvers, a shift that would later influence how prosecutors and defense attorneys presented their cases in court. Valentine's Day in the Richins household began like many others they had spent together over the years. It was February 14th, 2022, a day traditionally associated with affection, shared meals, and small gestures of appreciation between couples. That afternoon, the routine continued with a simple lunch. Kouri Richins, focused on her real estate activities and looming deadlines, stepped out of the house. She left with the intention of picking up a sandwich from a local diner in Kamas, Utah, the kind of meal she and Eric sometimes enjoyed together. Later filings in court revealed that the purchase was charged to a company account, and that a sandwich from that diner had been delivered to Eric's truck with a note attached. At the time, neither of them expected anything out of the ordinary. Valentine's Day was a chance to blend everyday obligations with a brief moment of connection. For Eric, the sandwich was part of that moment. He took the food from the vehicle and brought it inside, planning to take a bite and then return to his work or routine. Only a short time passed from the moment he bit into the sandwich until everything changed. According to prosecutors and court filings, One bite of the sandwich triggered a physical reaction in Eric that was both sudden and severe. Within moments, his body began to respond in a way that alarmed even him. Documents allege that Eric broke out into hives shortly after consuming part of the sandwich, and that he began to have difficulty breathing. The outward signs of distress were unmistakable. Raised welts forming on his skin and symptoms consistent with a serious allergic reaction. Prosecutors say that the sandwich was not ordinary food on that Valentine's Day. They allege that it was tainted, laced with fentanyl, that Kouri had obtained days earlier. Court records show that just 2 days before the Valentine's episode, she had purchased a quantity of fentanyl pills from a housekeeper, according to testimony from investigators and the housekeeper herself. Those pills, discovered later in the investigation, were significant because fentanyl is an opioid that can cause severe reactions even in small doses. While a tiny amount might not be lethal, any introduction of the substance into someone who did not knowingly take it could produce powerful effects. During this lunch, the symptoms that sprang up in Eric were not those of a mild reaction. They were serious, and they were undeniable. As the symptoms intensified, Eric realized that this was more than a simple upset stomach. His lungs felt constricted, and the network of raised welts continued spreading across his arms and torso. His breathing became strained. He could feel his airway tightening in a way that suggested a medical emergency. In those moments, instinct took over. Eric had access to an EpiPen, a small but powerful device meant to deliver epinephrine in case of life-threatening allergic reactions. According to charging documents filed later by prosecutors, Eric used the EpiPen that belonged to one of his sons. Moments after administering the injection into his thigh, he also consumed a bottle of Benadryl, an antihistamine that many families keep on hand for sudden allergic responses. The combination of the EpiPen and the Benadryl helped blunt the physical symptoms. His breathing eased, and the hives began to recede. But the moment was still frightening, and the severity of the reaction remained etched in memory. Only hours earlier, Valentine's Day had seemed like any other winter afternoon. By the time he rested after the symptoms eased, the memory of that lunch would come to dominate his thoughts. The EpiPen changed the direction of what could have been a truly fatal event. Once delivered, the epinephrine helped reverse the constriction in Eric's airway, a key factor in his survival. Benadryl worked on the histamines, flooding his system, reducing the rash and irritation. The immediate crisis passed. Eric lay down, exhausted from the physiological upheaval, and fell asleep. But the events of that lunch lingered in his mind. He had never experienced anything like it in his life. He had never been allergic to food before. He had eaten the same kinds of items from the same local diners without previous incident. Nothing in his medical history suggested a severe food allergy of this nature. And yet, the speed with which the reaction took hold, from the first bite to the injections he administered himself, made the situation feel unmistakably serious. Later that evening, after resting and recovering enough to communicate, Eric reached out to a close friend, someone he had known for years. In recounting the afternoon's events, he spoke honestly about what had happened. According to court filings, during that conversation, Eric told his friend something that would later play a central role in Prosecutors' theory. "I think my wife tried to poison me." Those words were simple, but they carried a weight far heavier than most casual remarks. They expressed a fear that went beyond a typical medical scare. For a husband to question the intentions of his spouse in such stark terms suggested a level of distrust that was, at the time, both personal and profound. What could have caused such a belief? Was it fear, confusion, the severity of the reaction, or genuine suspicion? At that point, only Eric truly knew, but his words would be logged, reported by the friend to detectives months later, and later entered into evidence as part of the attempted murder charge. The events of Valentine's Day did not immediately lead to a police investigation. At the time, no one had reported a crime, and there was no reason to suspect wrongdoing to outside observers. However, in the weeks that followed, information later collected by investigators suggested that Kouri reached out to the same housekeeper again about obtaining a stronger batch of fentanyl. According to testimony from that housekeeper and statements introduced in court, after the February 14 incident, Kouri contacted her and said that the pills she had previously sold were not potent enough, and that what she wanted was stronger. Those details would become significant later, because they suggested a possible escalation in whatever plan prosecutors allege was unfolding. The combination of this contact and the events of Valentine's Day created a narrative thread that investigators would investigate more deeply once Eric died weeks later. In the same period leading up to Valentine's Day, deleted text messages and witness statements recovered by police indicated that Kouri had purchased fentanyl pills from a known associate, the same housekeeper who later testified about the transactions. Court records showed that the initial acquisition took place days before February 14th, placing the purchase close to the alleged sandwich incident. Later, when she reached out again asking for pills that were allegedly stronger, that second contact occurred just days before the fatal poisoning event in March. Those text messages and the housekeeper's testimony provided investigators a link between the timing of imitation pills in hand and the two poisoning episodes prosecutors later alleged. This web of interactions, documented in phone records and witness statements, became central to the narrative prosecutors would build in Section 4 of the story when the official investigation intensifies. None of these details surfaced publicly at the time of the Valentine's Day incident. At that moment, it was treated as a scary medical occurrence that was resolved with emergency self-care and recovery. But once Eric died in March and detectives began combing through evidence, patterns emerged that drew attention back to that afternoon in February. Investigators later seized phone records, text messages, financial transactions, and interviews that painted a timeline leading up to Valentine's Day. They connected the purchase of fentanyl before February 14th and the subsequent request for stronger pills after the sandwich incident. Those findings provided prosecutors with additional context to allege that the earlier incident was part of a pattern, a first attempt to use the same drug later used in the fatal poisoning. This retroactive reconstruction of events marked a turning point in how the case was legally framed, from a tragic death to a pattern with alleged intent and preparatory actions. As we pull back and look at that Valentine's afternoon in isolation, consider something for a moment. A simple lunch, a sudden reaction, a frightening medical event. But in the aftermath, after injections, after rest, what would you do if someone you loved told you they didn't trust you anymore? If someone you trusted believed you were responsible for harming them? Regardless of your intentions, how would you respond? Would you dismiss it as a misunderstanding? Would you show reassurance and explain your side? Or would it change the way you interact with them forever? In cases like this, where everyday interactions turn into moments of suspicion, trust becomes a fragile thread. Once broken, the path forward is never the same. Before we move into the next part of this story, let me know in the comments what you think. What would you do if your spouse believed you were trying to harm them, and if you value deep, real-life narratives that reveal how motives and actions unfold over time. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys true crime stories that explore human behavior under pressure. In the early hours of March 5th, 2022, shortly after the emergency crews had left the Richins home, a team from the Utah office of the medical examiner took custody of Eric Richins' body for examination. At that point, his death was still classified as unexpected, but not yet a crime scene. The following morning, Dr. Pamela Sue Ulmer, then a forensic pathologist with the medical examiner's office, began the official autopsy. Ulmer's job was scientific and methodical, determine the cause of death by inspecting the body and analyzing laboratory results. In front of the jury later during the trial, Ulmer testified that Eric's body showed no signs of fatal heart disease, stroke, or other natural illness that would explain why he died. His heart appeared structurally normal, and there were no obvious signs of catastrophic organ failure that would lead to a sudden collapse in a man in his late 30s. Ulmer also noted that the physical characteristics of the body did not point to trauma. There were no wounds, fractures, or injuries that could account for the death. The only damage to his chest area occurred during CPR, which is standard in emergency response and can cause rib fractures as first responders attempt to revive an unresponsive body. The most important evidence, though, came from the toxicology report. When Ulmer and her team examined samples of Eric's blood and gastric contents, the laboratory results revealed the presence of fentanyl, a powerful opioid known for its potency and risk of fatal overdose. According to her testimony, the measured level of fentanyl in his blood was 15 nanograms per milliliter, which toxicologists describe as several times higher than what would typically be lethal for a person with no tolerance or history of sustained use. The drug was not part of any known prescription regimen for Eric. In fact, Ulmer confirmed that Eric had no documented history of pharmaceutical fentanyl use and no medical indication that he was being treated with opioids strong enough to produce such levels in his system. Additional components in the samples included minor amounts of ethanol and small traces of quetiapine, a drug not prescribed to Eric, but associated with medications his wife had used. Ulmer explained that these substances, while present, were not enough in quantity to account for his death or to explain the combination with such elevated fentanyl levels. Importantly, Ulmer stated that based on the scientific evidence, the cause of death was determined to be fentanyl intoxication, a clinical term meaning that the drug in his system reached a concentration sufficient to disrupt the body's vital functions, particularly respiratory control. But determining the manner of death, whether it was accidental, self-inflicted, or intentional, was a separate and more complicated decision. In her official report, Ulmer chose the classification of undetermined because the forensic evidence alone could not conclusively show how the drug entered Eric's body or whether another person administered it. This distinction mattered enormously in court. The autopsy established what killed Eric: fentanyl poisoning, but not who was responsible or how it was administered. That would become the domain of the investigation that followed. At first, Eric's passing was treated as an unexpected medical death. The paramedics and sheriff's deputies who responded that early morning in March 2022 had no immediate reason to suspect foul play beyond the toxicology results. The autopsy had established fentanyl intoxication as the cause of death, but the manner was listed as undetermined because the medical findings alone could not explain how the drug entered Eric's body or whether another person was involved. Once the toxicology and autopsy reports were complete, detectives with the Summit County Sheriff's Office began a deeper review of the case. Detectives treated the unexplained fentanyl levels as a red flag. A lethal concentration of fentanyl, especially 5 times a typical fatal dose, does not occur without a source. In the absence of a medical prescription or documented opioid use, that raises questions about how it entered Eric's system. Detective Jeff O'Driscoll, who later became a lead investigator in the case, oversaw the collection of additional evidence. His team interviewed first responders, checked for any witness statements, and sought out any records that could shed light on the hours leading up to Eric's death. They also reviewed the initial 911 call and dispatch records, noting Kouri's description of finding Eric unresponsive. From that point forward, the investigation shifted from a routine, unexplained death to a forensic inquiry involving phones, digital records, and financial documents. What had begun as a tragic loss was becoming something far more complex. A case requiring careful reconstruction of weeks and months leading up to March 4. One of the most significant breakthroughs for investigators came from Carmen Lauber, a woman who had worked as the Richins family housekeeper for several years. In early 2023, O'Driscoll's team learned that Lauber might have relevant information. Under a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, Lauber agreed to be interviewed. On the witness stand, Lauber testified that Kouri had repeatedly asked her to obtain pills believed to contain fentanyl in early 2022. She claimed that on at least 4 separate occasions, she purchased illicit opioid pills for Kouri, including once shortly before Valentine's Day and again near the time of Eric's death. Lauber's descriptions of these transactions formed a key pillar of the prosecution's case. She explained how she contacted other individuals in Utah who could provide the pills and how she delivered them to Kouri's residence. Under cross-examination, Lauber acknowledged her own past drug use and criminal history, and defense attorneys highlighted that she had received immunity in exchange for her cooperation, a fact that could influence jurors' assessment of her credibility. With the autopsy and witness interviews advancing the investigation, digital evidence became another essential line of inquiry. Detectives seized multiple phones linked to the Richins household and other involved parties. Among them were the devices of a man identified in court as Kouri's romantic partner, whose text messages featured prominently in the prosecution's narrative. Forensic analysts extracted data from these devices, organizing text, timestamps, and location information into searchable formats that detectives could use. They also downloaded content from 2 Apple iPhones connected to the case, enabling them to trace interactions between Kouri and other key figures. One significant detail that emerged from the phone data was activity around the night of Eric's death. Records showed that Kouri's phone was unlocked multiple times in the early morning hours before the 911 call was placed, a sequence investigators later presented as part of their chronology. Outside of that night, phone records also helped establish patterns of communication between Kouri and the housekeeper, as well as between Kouri and her romantic partner. These interactions were later put into evidence as part of the overall motive framework. Among the digital evidence introduced early in the trial were text messages Kouri allegedly exchanged with a man prosecutors identified as her romantic partner. During opening statements, the prosecutor highlighted messages that appeared to reflect a desire to be free of Eric, referencing plans for a future that would include travel and companionship absent her husband. According to prosecution summaries, one such message, reportedly sent the day before Eric's death, asked whether a future together was possible. Another, months earlier, expressed a wish for life without Eric if circumstances were different. These messages were referenced as supporting evidence that Kouri saw a life without her husband and may have viewed Eric's death as a means to achieve it. Defense attorneys objected to the implication, arguing that personal texts do not prove intent to harm. Although the defense disputed the interpretation of these texts, their existence in the digital record further illustrated how the prosecution built links between personal communications and alleged motive. Investigators also scrutinized financial documentation related to life insurance. Court records and tax filings showed that Kouri had obtained multiple life insurance policies on Eric's life, with combined potential benefits amounting to close to $2 million. Although life insurance is a common financial tool for families, The context here became relevant because multiple policies were taken out and structured in ways that raised questions. Prosecutors contended that Kouri stood to receive significant payouts in the event of Eric's death, a point they presented alongside the discovery of very high debt balances tied to her business ventures. Defense attorneys emphasized that convertible life insurance is not unusual, and that receiving such benefits does not inherently suggest culpability. They also highlighted that policy changes and beneficiary designations were matters of legal and financial arrangement, separate from the cause of death itself. Parallel to the digital and financial evidence were documents showing the extensive debts associated with Kouri's real estate enterprises. Prosecutors brought forward spreadsheets, loan records, and hard money lending documentation showing what they described as multi-million-dollar liabilities owed by Kouri. These debts were tied to house flipping projects and ambitious property renovations that had not yielded sufficient returns. The prosecution's narrative linked these financial pressures with the alleged motive for Eric's death, contending that the strain of these obligations contributed to a desire for rapid wealth transfer via insurance proceeds and estate interests. Defense counsel responded by framing the financial picture as complex, but not directly tied to proof of planned wrongdoing. They argued that business difficulties do not equate to a criminal scheme, emphasizing alternative explanations for the financial challenges. As the investigation advanced, detectives uncovered documentation that became part of additional charges beyond the murder count. Among these were allegations that Kouri had engaged in fraudulent loan applications, including documents containing forged signatures purportedly of Eric. These examples of financial irregularity were brought before jurors not only to explain the context of Kouri's mounting obligations, but to paint a picture of repeated deceptive actions involving Eric's accounts and signatures. Prosecutors argued this pattern illustrated a broader effort to secure funds and financial advantage in ways that bypassed proper consent. Defense attorneys disputed the characterization of these documents, highlighting procedural issues and asserting that not all of the records were directly tied to fraudulent intent. Just 2 days after Eric's death, tensions within the family quickly surfaced in ways that drew law enforcement attention separate from the poisoning inquiry. According to court filings, another dispute erupted between Kouri Richins and Amy Richins, Eric's sister, over access to belongings in the Richins home. Prosecutors allege that Kouri summoned a locksmith to the property to open a safe that belonged to Eric. Prosecutors say that the safe contained various personal items, financial documents, and other property that Eric had intended to control through his estate planning. Eric's estate had been placed under the control of a living trust created before his death, with his sister Kouri Richins Benson named as trustee. As a result, many of the key estate assets were no longer directly accessible to Kouri, in accordance with Eric's wishes to protect his business and other property from potential mismanagement. The estate plan included direction that certain assets were intended for the boys, not for Kouri's direct use. Amy objected to Kouri's attempts to open the safe, asserting that it was part of the trust and did not legally belong to Kouri. A heated confrontation followed, during which prosecutors alleged that Kouri became physically aggressive toward Amy. According to account statements, Kouri struck Amy in the face and neck during the altercation, prompting a later misdemeanor assault charge. Kouri ultimately pleaded no contest to that assault charge, a legal resolution that avoided a full trial on the incident, but acknowledged the basic facts of the event. While seemingly a separate matter from the homicide investigation, this confrontation became part of the broader narrative prosecutors presented about how Kouri reacted after Eric's death, particularly when legal control of the estate was not in her favor. The assault charge that followed the safe dispute was relatively minor in legal terms, but carried emotional weight in the context of the investigation. Prosecutors argued that Kouri's reaction demonstrated personal frustration and a lack of restraint during a period of intense family stress. Amy Richins described the incident as painful and unexpected, telling law enforcement she had only tried to stop Kouri from forcing entry into a locked safe. The interaction left visible marks on her face and neck, according to her description. In court filings from April 2022, prosecutors made clear that the assault was not merely a family dispute, but part of how the events in the days after Eric's death played out legally. Even though the assault charge was prosecuted separately from the murder indictment, it became one of several actions that prosecutors referenced when portraying the overall picture of Kouri's behavior following the tragedy. The prosecution suggested these actions pointed to a temperament under stress, rather than the grief-filled decorum typically expected after a sudden spousal death. Defense attorneys, however, countered that this incident was being unfairly tied to the murder case. They argued that two grieving sisters at a tense family gathering could easily lapse into heated arguments, especially when discussions turned to financial control of a safe at the center of an estate dispute. They asserted that this type of confrontation was not unusual under intense emotional conditions, especially when the future of children's inheritance was at stake. The misdemeanor assault plea, they argued, was a way to resolve the family conflict without letting it overshadow other legal matters. One of the twists that captured public attention was not part of the investigation itself, but how Kouri presented her life to the world after Eric's death. On March 7, 2023, nearly a year after the fatal incident at their home, Kouri self-published a children's book titled, "Are You With Me?" The book was described by family and local media as a way for her and her sons to process their grief after losing their father. The narrative of the book is simple. It follows a child's journey through loss and helps explain that someone's presence can continue even after they're gone. By publishing the book, Kouri explained in interviews that she hoped to create something that would comfort her boys, and perhaps other children facing similar sorrow, as they adapted to life without their father. Shortly after its publication, she appeared on local television shows, including Good Things Utah, where she discussed the book and its purpose in terms of coping with loss. At that time, the trial nearly a year later was not yet underway, and many viewers assumed, as many members of the local community did, that she was simply sharing a personal project born of grief. Yet the proximity and timing between the book's launch and her later arrest gave prosecutors an opportunity to incorporate the work into their broader narrative. They highlighted that the book received public attention and praise before becoming a central point in national reporting about the case once she was charged. The prosecution suggested that while the book was marketed as a message of solace, its publication also kept Kouri's name in the media at a time when legal scrutiny was growing. Defense counsel countered that any attempt to interpret the book as evidence of guilt was misguided. They emphasized that a grieving mother's efforts to help her children navigate sorrow should not be held against her legally. This clash over the perception and role of the book underscored how certain events in the investigation transcended courtroom evidence and entered the realm of public perception and media narrative. Once the case reached the news, through arrest announcements, trial hearings, and dramatic revelations about fentanyl, financial entanglements, and personal relationships, coverage expanded beyond Utah. National outlets, including CBS News and the Associated Press, reported on the case, noting the unusual combination of a suspected poisoning and a children's book released in the interim, all amidst allegations of financial motives and fraudulent behavior. Public interest was fueled in part by the way the case blended elements that felt both tragic and dramatic. A father's unexpected death, a wife with financial challenges, a controversial book about grief, and a trial that challenged assumptions about what grief looks like under scrutiny. Media outlets highlighted the legal drama unfolding in Summit County, noting that the decision to bring so many charges, including aggravated murder, attempted murder, fraud, and forgery, was somewhat rare in family homicide cases. National news coverage also emphasized the vast financial issues that surrounded the Richins household. Reports noted that Kouri had secured multiple life insurance policies on Eric's life, over $2 million in total benefits, and had significant debts tied to real estate investments in early 2022. These financial details were presented alongside early documentation of the Valentine's Day incident, further underscoring how weeks of activity led to a larger narrative that ultimately resulted in her indictment. News stories also touched on the reactions of local residents, many of whom remembered Eric as a dedicated father and business owner. Some expressed disbelief that such a dramatic case would unfold in their quiet community. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about how financial strain and personal decisions can ripple outward into consequences no one expected. Even the defense saw media attention as impactful. Defense attorneys repeatedly argued to judges that pretrial publicity was so extensive that it threatened the possibility of unbiased jurors, though motions to move venue or delay proceedings were largely denied. Jurors interviewed during selection acknowledged they had seen media coverage, forcing the court to emphasize non-discussion and impartiality instructions. National media attention shaped public perception, turned local legal proceedings into topics of conversation across multiple states, and ensured that this story, a tragic household loss complicated by alleged criminal conduct, would reach far beyond Utah's mountain communities. In early May 2023, detectives with the Summit County Sheriff's Office formally arrested Kouri Richins at her home in northern Utah. The charge was aggravated murder in the death of her husband, Eric Richins, whose body had been found in March 2022 with a fatal amount of fentanyl in his system. At the time, investigators believed the drug was administered through a Moscow Mule cocktail made the previous night. Prosecutors alleged that earlier in February, Kouri had also tried to poison Eric with a sandwich that caused a severe allergic reaction. To support these charges, they pointed to phone records, digital searches, text messages, drug acquisition evidence, and financial documents they said showed motive and planning. On May 8th, 2023, the formal indictment was issued. Along with aggravated murder, Kouri faced an attempted murder charge connected to the Valentine's Day incident, where Eric became violently ill after eating the sandwich Kouri brought home. Prosecutors viewed this earlier episode as part of a pattern leading up to the fatal overdose. Additional charges were added later as the investigation unfolded. These included insurance fraud, mortgage and loan fraud, and forgery related to alleged financial misrepresentations and secret insurance policies taken out on Eric's life without his knowledge. Prosecutors argued that Kouri stood to benefit financially from his death, particularly as she was facing millions in debt from her real estate ventures at the time. Following the indictment, Kouri was held in custody without bail. A detention hearing in 2023 saw prosecutors argue that sufficient evidence existed to support the murder charges, and the judge agreed to keep her detained pending trial. Testimony at that hearing previewed some of the evidence the state intended to present, including text messages, property purchases, and search history from Kouri's phone that suggested consciousness of guilt. The legal battle was set to begin in earnest, and the stage was prepared for prosecutors and defense attorneys to frame opposite narratives about what really happened in the Richins home that March night. The inclusion of an attempted murder charge alongside the aggravated murder count set this case apart from many homicide prosecutions. Instead of focusing only on the fatal overdose in March, prosecutors built their case on a theory of escalation. They alleged that the Valentine's Day sandwich incident in February reflected an earlier failed attempt to harm Eric, and that the fatal March poisoning was a continuation of that plan. This dual incident theory became a central point of contention between the two sides. Prosecutors argued that Valentine's reaction was unlikely to be an ordinary allergic response, given the timing of Elliot's severe symptoms and the documented purchase of fentanyl shortly before. They presented this as the first step in what they claimed was a calculated effort to kill Eric. Defense attorneys responded that linking the two events constituted overreach. They argued that an allergic reaction or unexplained medical emergency did not prove illegal activity or motive, and that the prosecution was inferring intent where none could be firmly established. According to the defense, circumstantial similarities did not equate to a pattern of criminal action, particularly when direct evidence of administration was lacking. In addition to these violent charges, the indictment included counts of insurance fraud, forgery, and financial crimes. Prosecutors contended that Kouri's efforts to acquire life insurance policies on Eric's life, policies worth nearly $2 million, without his full knowledge and her alleged manipulation of loan applications, indicated a broader scheme tied to financial desperation and possible motive. Kouri's mounting debts and her real estate business struggles were woven into this narrative during pretrial hearings. Defense attorneys pushed back on these financial allegations by asserting that business difficulties do not equate to criminal intent. They maintained that insurance and financial arrangements can be legal and legitimate, even if they appear questionable in hindsight. The trial officially commenced in late February 2026 in Summit County District Court before Judge Richard Mrazek. Both sides were given an opportunity to outline their positions to the jury, offering the first detailed glimpses into how they planned to argue the case. Prosecutor Brad Bloodworth delivered the state's opening statement with emphasis on motive and opportunity. Bloodworth portrayed the case as one in which Kouri murdered Eric for his money and to get a fresh start at life, citing her substantial debts and the $4 million plus estate she would have inherited upon his death. He pointed to email searches on Kouri's phone, such as inquiries about deleting messages and luxury prisons, as evidence of planning and consciousness of guilt. He also noted text messages exchanged with the man identified as her romantic partner, including discussions about leaving her husband and building a life together after his death. Defense attorney Catherine Nestor began her opening by playing an emotionally powerful piece of evidence: the 911 call made by Kouri on the night Eric died, in which she is heard sobbing and struggling to explain what had happened. Nestor asked jurors to consider those sounds as the reaction of a wife who had just discovered her husband unresponsive, not as evidence of guilt. She argued that the state's case was constructed on circumstantial evidence, not direct proof that Kouri administered any drug. Nestor further emphasized that Eric had suffered from Lyme disease and had a history of painkiller use, suggesting that his fentanyl level could have arisen from personal pharmacological choices or medical confusion, rather than intentional poisoning. These early courtroom portrayals set the tone for the months of testimony that would follow, with prosecution and defense presenting sharply contrasting versions of the events leading up to Eric's death. Once opening statements concluded, the state called its first witnesses to the stand. Among the earliest and most critical was Dr. Pamela Sue Ulmer, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy. Ulmer reiterated the findings she had outlined previously, that Eric's body contained a lethal amount of fentanyl, and that no natural cause could explain his death. Her testimony was directed at establishing the cause of death in clear clinical terms, and she confirmed in court that the level was several times higher than common fatal doses in opioid-naive individuals. Ulmer's testimony was bolstered by toxicology reports, an expert interpretation that positioned the fentanyl level as inconsistent with accidental ingestion. Other forensic experts took the stand to explain how samples were collected and analyzed, ensuring that the methodology met scientific standards. These witnesses helped translate the complex laboratory data into understandable terms for jurors, emphasizing how the quantitative measurements indicated a drug concentration associated with fatal poisoning rather than therapeutic or incidental exposure. Prosecutors also introduced evidence regarding residue, metabolism timelines, and comparative ranges of fentanyl levels. While defense counsel questioned some aspects of interpretive certainty, no significant disputes arose over the reliability of the toxicology results themselves. Rather, the debate centered on the question of how the fentanyl entered Eric's system, a question that forensic evidence alone cannot answer without reconstruction of events and motives. This body of testimony established the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case, anchoring the cause of death in medically accepted data interpreted by trained professionals. As the trial progressed past the forensic presentation, the defense shifted focus toward alternative explanations for Eric's death. One of the core elements of the defense strategy was to challenge the assumption that Eric's fatal overdose must have been intentional or administered by someone else. Defense attorneys argued during testimony that Eric's prior health issues, including chronic pain and documented use of painkillers, could have led him to seek out stronger drugs on his own, or otherwise inadvertently ingest what proved to be a lethal dose. While he did not have a prescription for fentanyl, defense counsel highlighted that opioid use and self-medication can occur outside strict medical supervision and urged jurors to consider that possibility. Defense strategists also scrutinized gaps in the prosecution's timeline. One point raised was that no one witnessed the administration of fentanyl. No drink vessel was directly tested by crime scene analysts, and no physical instrument of drug delivery was recovered. The defense stressed that absence of direct evidence undercuts any claim that Kouri had physically administered the drug to Eric. Beyond that, they argued that skepticism of witness testimony and credibility, including that of the housekeeper who testified about past fentanyl purchases, was necessary for jurors to fairly assess the prosecution's claims. During cross-examinations, defense attorneys worked to peel away layers of inference in the prosecutor's arguments, asking whether alternative scenarios, including accidental overdose, mislabeled pills, or self-administration by Eric, could logically explain the medical findings without resorting to an allegation of murder. While acknowledging the emotional difficulty of such questions, the defense maintained that evidence, not speculation, must drive the verdict in such a weighty case. The prosecution's case hinged heavily on motive as one of its core pillars. Beyond the scientific evidence that a lethal dose of fentanyl was present in Eric's system, prosecutors argued to the jury that Kouri's financial situation provided a compelling reason to commit the crime. As stated in opening arguments, she was significantly in debt. One estimate presented by the prosecution placed her liabilities in the millions due to her real estate business, and stood to gain substantial financial benefit if Eric died, and she inherited his estate and life insurance proceeds. In court, prosecutor Brad Bloodworth emphasized that Eric's inheritance would have included ownership of his masonry business, a thriving property in its own right, and a multi-million-dollar estate portfolio. Bloodworth described how Kouri's own pursuits, including high-cost property acquisitions and a mansion purchase set to close the day after Eric's death, placed significant pressure on her finances. The argument framed these debts not as incidental business challenges, but as urgent personal burdens that could have motivated a desperate act. Defense attorneys contested this portrayal of motive. They argued that financial strain alone does not prove intent to kill. Even large debts, the defense maintained, are common among entrepreneurs and investors. Losses or negative balances do not equate to premeditated murder. In addition, defense counsel pointed out that financial documents and loan details could be interpreted in ways that did not necessarily spell imminent collapse. They argued that jurors should separate normal business risk from alleged criminal intent. As part of this debate, jurors heard testimony from financial witnesses who detailed the state of Kouri's real estate commitments, but also contextualized them within market conditions and typical investment risk. This testimony was intended to demonstrate that while financial pressure existed, it was not, in and of itself, sufficient evidence of motive for a crime as severe as aggravated murder. Throughout the trial, emotional testimony occasionally shifted focus from the legal arguments to the personal tragedy at the case's core. The three young boys left fatherless after Eric's death. Family members, including Eric's siblings, described the profound impact the loss had on his children. One sister recounted how the youngest struggled with the absence of a parent's guidance, and how the boys continued to grapple with understanding what had happened to their father. Jury members heard about custody decisions and the family arrangements put in place to support the children after March 2022 and into the trial period. These accounts served as poignant reminders of the real human cost behind the legal proceedings, beyond abstract arguments about evidence and intent. The narrative of loss and grief added depth to the courtroom record, compelling jurors and observers to weigh not just facts, but the lived consequences for those left behind. Because the trial was covered extensively by national and local media, public reaction became part of the broader story. Major outlets such as CBS News and the Associated Press described the case prominently, noting the unusual pairing of a suspected poisoning and the existence of a self-published children's book about grief authored by the defendant. Many observers expressed disbelief or fascination at how those elements intersected. These public interpretations often highlighted aspects that blurred the lines between personal tragedy and criminal accusation. Some in the community saw the focus on the book as unfair to a grieving mother, while others saw it as a strange and compelling detail in what was otherwise a grim legal narrative. At the time of this script's creation, the trial remained ongoing, with testimony continuing through early March 2026, and no verdict yet reached. Additional witnesses were expected to include the family's housekeeper, forensic accountants, digital evidence analysts, and possible character witnesses from both sides. General public live streams of the proceedings drew attention, underscoring the prolonged and multifaceted nature of this legal battle. The defense and prosecution both indicated intentions to appeal certain evidentiary rulings, suggesting that any verdict, whether conviction or acquittal, would likely be followed by further legal challenges. Throughout this case, audiences have been challenged to reflect not only on the mechanics of a legal trial, but on the deeper human themes at its heart. This is a story about trust. A husband believed in his wife's care and intentions. Greed, financial strain, and hidden pressures shaped perceptions and interpretations of behavior. Deception, the difference between what is seen and what is known, can transform lives. The danger of hidden lives. Secrets beneath a surface of normalcy can have devastating consequences. A father who loved his sons. A wife who wrote a book about grief. And a question that still haunts this case. Was this the story of a grieving widow? Carefully written cover story. Let me know your thoughts below. And if you want more deep dives into the legal battles that define modern true crime storytelling, like this video, leave a comment and subscribe for future episodes.